Hi all, welcome to Cyber Warfare Labs AWS Cloud Red Team course. In this module, we will discuss about how we can misuse Lambda functions to create a persistence backdoor in AWS account. Using persistence, we can have a long-term access on AWS account. So we will discuss how we can use the Lambda function and misuse the Lambda functions to create a persistence backdoor in AWS account. So you can see here in this diagram, suppose we have one Lambda function, there is some code is already there. The code it's depend on the functionality of the particular functions. Now suppose you compromised a user and this user have a sufficient rights on these Lambda functions. So this user can update the code, this user can invoke the functions. Now suppose if this user first download the code from the Lambda functions and then create a backdoor up and change this function code and again upload this code or update the code again on the Lambda function itself. So when anybody invoke this Lambda function, our backdooring code will be executed, and whatever operations or whatever backdoor you mention there, whatever code you define there will be executed. So suppose I define there is a reverse shell, so every time when anybody invoke this Lambda function, you will get a reverse shell. So you can execute the command here whenever or every time when somebody invoke this function. So it's basically depend upon how you create the persistence. You can create a backdoor depend upon the what permissions this Lambda function have. It's also important that what permission this Lambda function have, so that the code will be executed the permission which is defined to this Lambda function. So this is how there is a multiple way you can create the backdoor, but in this case what we are going to do, we are going to modify the code. Function will be the same, function name will be the same, but code will be the difference. So you can see the initially is the code 1. After we modified, it will be a code 1 which is the similar the first one and with a backdoor, the reverse shell backdoor. So this is how you can create the backdooring using Lambda functions. One thing you should be keep in note that you should have a sufficient rights to invoke as well as update the function. So let's see how practically we can do it and how we can execute our command on the remote runtime environment of Lambda functions. Okay, so suppose I compromised a user. This user have a sufficient rights. So first we have to check what rights does this user have. So currently I already configured my AWS CLI with secret as key. Let's see what users I compromised and what rights does I have. So let's just start one by one. So you can see here I'm using STS to identify what user I compromised or what the key which I configured is belongs to which user or which roles. So suppose I compromised one user and I configure the access key in one of the profile, name is Lambda. So you can see here this access key, the profile which I configured and the key which is there in this particular profile is belongs to this user. So I have a rights, I have all the permission, I can do whatever thing or whatever permissions is belongs to this user. So let's see what permission this user have. So what we are going to have, we are going to see all managed policy which is attached to this user. There is one more thing, you can also see the inline policy, but I'm only looking for the managed policy right now. So all AWS managed policy as well as customer managed policy which is attached to this user. So open a new tab, paste it here. You have to specify the username. So this is the username I have. Now you have to specify the profile because this is the profile I'm going to use to do all the operations. Okay, so you can see here there is 3 managed policy which is attached to this user. First one is I am read only access, which is a AWS managed policy. That means I can list it down all the attached policy. I can do I can do all the operation related to IAM, but I have only read only access. So whatever thing I'm doing here, like list attached policy using this users because I have these rights, or this is a policy which is attached to this user. So it's I think it's not important for our perspective, because we are looking for updation policy. Is there any policy we can manage, or we can invoke the Lambda function, or we can update the code of Lambda function. Second policy, we have API read only. So this is also important, because if you want to invoke the function, how you are going to invoke? Is there any API, or is there any event which belongs to this function? So this is the read only policy. This is also second case. If you are going to enumerate about API, you should have at least this policy attached to the users. So there may be a case that suppose you have any other user, or you already know what are the policies attached to this user. You can left all this policy, or you can no need to worry about if this policy is attached or not. You are only interested in this policy. So there is a policy AWS Lambda full access. Seems like this is a customer managed policy. Let's see what permission is defined there in this policy. So now what we are going to do, we are going to get the information about what permission is defined in this policy. So there may be a case that we have a multiple version of the same policy. So you can check the version which is the default version and which is currently version we are using it. So I specify here, you have to specify the version ID. So I specify v1. You can check. So there is one more command. You can check how many versions are there on this particular policy. So you can check the IAM sections where you have all the information, how we can retrieve how many versions are there, what are the commands we use. Now you have to specify the policy errand. So this is the policy which is attached, which is a customer managed policy. Let's specify the policy errand, and then you have to specify the profile, because this is the profile I'm going to use for my every operations in this persistence. Okay, so definitely that's the get policy version. You have to define the policy ARN, and then the version ID as well as the profile, which user rights you have to access the get version policies. Okay, so you can see here these are the rights which is there in this particular policy. So you have EC2 rights, you have these rights, and you can see there is Lambda star. That means you can do whatever operation you want to perform on the Lambda. You can create a new Lambda function. So this is also a case, persistency case. You can create a new Lambda function and you can define the code according to your choice. But this is a more sensitive, and it is if you create a Lambda function, it's like highly monitored by the security team or security operations center team. So the best way to update the existing code, and in existing code itself, you can, if you update the layers, that is really undetectable. Why? Because if you update or if you create the backdoor inside the code itself, so maybe there is a chance that when developer looking for the code, they found your backdoor. But if you adding your backdoor inside the layers, means a library or third-party library, there is a very less number of chance that they were looking for those particular libraries. So there is multiple way you can avoid detection by the manual analysis as well as automated analysis. So you can see here I have administrator rights on Lambda functions, because I can do all the operation on all the resources. So this is also important. So there is one more, pass the role is also there, but this is important for us. This is really important for us. What is permissions this user have? Then only we can do the operation on further. So we understood that we can perform any operation on any resources of Lambda functions. So there may be a case that this user have only rights to update or perform all the operation on this particular Lambda function. So this is a resource. You can see the resource is a star. But for your red team operation, you will find a lot of time that this user have only administrator rights on this particular Lambda function. Then you have to only options to change the code of this particular functions. So this is how you can do the persistency. So let's see, we understood that we have a full rights on this Lambda function. So this user have a full rights on this Lambda function. Now what we are going to do, first we are going to enumerate all the functions which is there in AWS account, because we know that we have permissions on all the functions. So let's see how many functions are there and which is like more unique function or more attractive function which is invoked multiple times. But it's depend upon the red teamers thinking that which function they choose to create the backdoor. So suppose okay, now what we are going to do, we are going to list it down all the function which is there in this AWS environment. So let's open a new tab, paste it here. Oh, sorry, because I forgot to use my profile, because I have to use the profile which I compromised. This is the user profile, which is the rights I'm using. You have to specify the reason. That is really important for the Lambda function, and most of the services you have to define the reason. If you define the reason, then these services will be listed down on the particular reason. So suppose US East, you can brute force the reason as well. So I define this function. So you can see there is a red team Lambda function 1, red team Lambda function 2, as well as a red team. So there are 3 functions. Actually there are 4 functions there in this particular account. So it's depend upon you're looking for the code, or you can do a lot of other enumeration techniques which is more useful function and which is relevant, because there is a case that when you are going to invoke the function, how you invoke it. So if you found that there is an API which doesn't have any key, and you can directly this API is used to invoke this function. So you can only create a backdoor on those functions, because it's very easy to invoke these functions. Because if you found that there is a function, there is no invoking is there, so it's senseless. So there is a multiple way you can identify which is more important function, you can create the backdoor. Okay, so I'm just only looking for these functions. Let's see what is the code which is there in this function, and then only you can update the code. You are not going to create a new function, or you are not going to update a full code, because when a developer looking for the code, they found that it's a malicious code, or you breaking the functionality of this application or whatever where this particular function or Lambda function is using. So you have to be understandable about the particulars, the operations or the functionality which is done by this particular Lambda functions. Okay, so what we are going to do, we are going to download the source code of this particular functions. So let's see, copy this one. We are going to download, because we have all the rights, we have administrator rights on all the resources of Lambda function. You have to define the function name. So this is the function, that team fun1, and you have to define the profile. Yes, we have to define the reason, US East 2. Okay, so you can see here the same information. It's running on Python 3.7. This is the role which is attached to this function. This is also important. If you found that there is a role which have a higher privileged, you can create a backdoor on those roles, because if you want to execute anything on that role, you will get the access of this particular role which is defined to this Lambda functions. So it's basically depend upon the red teamer's perspective, their motive, their enumeration techniques, or what information they already have, and what is motive they have, how you can create the backdoor, or you can choose the functions to creating the backdoor. This is the time-based URL. Basically, it will the URL, you can use this URL to download the Lambda functions, the code which is there. Using this URL, you can see this function is downloaded. The code of this function is downloaded. If I open this one, extract this, and let's see what is the information this function contains. So you can see here, when we invoke this function, this is the code which is there in this particular function. So it's basically depend upon the what is use, or what is the usability of this particular function, and what is functions, what is the operations defined in these functions. So you can create the backdoor here in this particular function. Let's see what other thing we are really interested is how we can invoke these functions. Because if you found that there is one API which is going to invoke this function, and you can directly call the API without an API key, that's really helpful for us, because we can just craft the API URL and you can invoke this function. Second thing, there may be chance that this function is invoked by any event or any stream based invocation method. So there is multiple ways. So let's check what policy this function contain, who have a rights to invoke these functions. So what we are going to do, retrieve the policy information about the specific Lambda function. So basically I'm looking for the who have a rights to invoke this function and how we can invoke this function. So I'll just copy this one. You have to specify the function name, same here. I specify the function name, profile and reason. Just copy this one. Okay, so you can see here, this is a policy which is attached to this functions. And when you see the statement, effect allow, principal API gateway can invoke these functions, actions invoke, this is a resource that when retrieve function one, conditions, you can see here, this is the API ID, and there is a staging as well as method. You can see here who can invoke this particular function, this particular endpoint, or we can resource. So this is how you can identify who can invoke this function. So how we can craft the URL. So this is the API ID. I know that this API ID can invoke this function. Let's see, because we have a rights to enumerate the information about the API, how we can craft the URL so we can invoke this function. And this is really important. We will also discuss about how we can craft the URL respective of API gateway. So let's see, is this API gateway or this particular API is needed any authentication or any API key, how we can craft, what method they use to invoke this function, what parameter they required, what staging environment, or what basically resource or endpoint they use to invoke these functions. So I'm only looking for this API. So this is an API ID basically. Let's see what other information I can find out about this API ID. So what we are going to do, we are going to enumerate information about API ID. So this is a command which will give you all the REST API or the API which you mentioned, specific API, because we are only looking for the specific API. We have the API ID. Let's open a new tab, paste it here. You have to specify the API ID. So this is the API ID. Now you have to mention the profile name, because that's really important, and you have to also mention the we can say reason. You can see this is the reason where this API is placed. So I just copy this whole command and paste it here. Okay, so you can see here the name of this API is red team function UI. So it seems like this is the API which is used to invoke this function. When it's created, what type of endpoint that is supported. So let's check the further more information about this API. What resource, because when you craft a URL, there is a lot more thing you have to understand. There is a lot more thing you have to enumerate basically. You have to enumerate the method supported by API, API key supported or not, any resource or endpoints, stays, and so these are the things you have to enumerate to craft a the URL. So first we are going to enumerate about resources. So how many resources are there in this particular API? So you have to see list of resources which is there in this particular API. You have to specify the API ID. This is the command I'm going to use. Okay, so you can see here there is only one resource, two resources. This is the default resource and this is our endpoint, basically red team fun1. This is a API name as well, or we can say function name as well, and as well this is the endpoint. So this is the endpoint which we are going to hit, so you can invoke this particular function. So there is only one resource is there in. So two resource, one is a default resource, this is a root resource, and this is a one more resource is there. So now what we are going to enumerate, we are going to enumerate information about this particular resource. So let's copy this command. You have to specify the API ID. So this is the API ID. I'm just copy the whole command, paste it here. Then you have to specify the resource ID as well, because then only you can get the information about this particular resource. So resource ID is this one. Okay, so this is the resource ID. So same informations you can see here, but if you have a multiple resource, you have around 500 endpoints, you can find out the particular resource and you can get the information using this get resource command. But I already have this information. Let's move to the another information. So we know this is the API ID and this is a resource. There is only one resource, so this is the resource which we are going to use. Now what next? Methods. So what type of method does it support this particular resource? You can copy this command. So specifically give the information about, you have to specify the method and it will give the information. If you use this method, what is going to need. I'll show you how it's worked. So you have to specify what information? API ID. So just copy the API ID from here. Then you have to specify the resource ID. I know there are only two resources. I'm interested in these resources, so just copy this resource ID. Then method. So you have to specify the method. Let's see what we can get for. We can get if we specify the get method, what information we can get it from here. And you have to specify the profile as well as reason. This is really must. Okay, so we can see here I'm getting this error invalid method identified specified. That means the developer or the administrator of API gateway did not set any default method. So if we are looking for a API gateway in AWS, you can specify the any to if there is no method is specified here. Okay, so you can see here, so whatever method you can invoke this function. So you can use get method, you can use post method. So it's when we say any method, you can use any methods like get, post, or put to invoke this particular this to hit this particular API, and this API is going to invoke the corresponding Lambda functions. So you can see here you can have you can use any methods. There is no authorization is required, no API key is required. So that is really important. This is because if there is API key is required, you have to enumerate the API key. Then only you can invoke these functions. And this is the integration part. So if you invoke this particular API gateway, what is going to have in the back end? So you can see it will basically have an AWS proxy. In the back end, your API gateway will send a request to post request. You can see this method is post request to this particular ARN. And the ARN, it seems like there is a Lambda function, so it basically hits the Lambda functions, and it will invoke these Lambda functions. So this is how you can identify which method we use. So here you can use whatever method you want to use, because here it's specified any. This is really important because you found that there is no method is supported, no method is specified. You can use, even if you want to change for the post, it will give the same error. That means there is no default method is specified. You can use whatever method you want to use and you can invoke this function. But the important thing is this one: does it require authorization, does it require an API key, and what is going to have in backend it's going to invoke. So you can see this is happening there in the backend. So in backend, this API gateway which you are going to invoke is going to basically invoke the Lambda function and send the post request in the backend. So this is how integration is happening in the backend. Okay, so let's open this one. Now we know. So basically what information we know? We know resource, we know methods. You can use whatever method you want to use. The resource we already know, that is red team function 1. Now what we are going to enumerate is states. States basically the environment. So suppose you divided your API in different stages. One is for testing, one is for development, one is for any other purpose, or you can define in version 1, version 2, version 3. It's depend upon the organization to organizations. But this is really important because if you want to craft a URL, you should know the states. So this is the command which will list it down all the states for this particular API. So open a new tab, you have to specify the API ID. So let's copy the API ID from here and the profile as well as reason. So you can see here there is only one stage and name is default. So by default there is one stage. This is a default in AWS. So you can have the name version 1, version 2, or dev, prod, or stage, whatever environment you want to choose. So this is really important. So what we have, these are informations about the particular API. You can also get the information about the stage, just like if you have multiple stages, if you want to look for the particular information about the specified stage, you can use this command. Get stage, you have to specify the API ID as well as the stage name. So it will give you the same information like we got here. Now what next? So you can see what information we got. We know the API ID. This is the API ID. How we can craft this URL? So this is the API ID. So this will become here. Now what next? This will be the same execute API, which will be there in the URL. Here you have to define the reason. So we know this is the reason. This is the reason. We already know what is the reason is. Then here you have to define the stage. Stage, we know stage is default when we enumerate. Then we have to define the resource. So resource will be the red team function 1. So these are the information. This is important. Then this is the method. So you can use get, post, put, or any other methods to invoke this particular functions. Because there is already defined any, so you can use any, whatever method you want to choose. So this is the command we will get, or this is the URL we crafted to invoke this particular functions. There is no API keys required, so you no need to include or no need to identify any API key. So this, if you hit this command using browser or any HTTP clients, you will invoke the function. Now what is pending from our side? We know that how we can invoke the function. We know that what is code there in this particular function. You can add the backdoor and you can upload the functions code. This is the important step to creating the backdoor or persistent backdoor inside the AWS account. So this is the command which basically going to update the existing functions or existing code which is already there. You can create the you can add the backdoor in the existing code and you can again upload it, or you can have the fresh code. So it basically update the function. So function information will be the same, but code will be the different. So it's depend upon you how you can creating the backdoor. So this is a function which we are going to, this is a command which we are going to use to update the code. So let's see, suppose I created another functions or the file, because we know it's a Python supported, or you can use this thing in your existing function code. So I'm just open a new port, notepad. This is a existing code is there. So I use this one and I create the backdoor. So this is it will be our new code. So what I did, I created a backdoor. So every time when you invoke this function, I specify my command and control server IP address as well as port. So when anybody invoke this function or any API gateway invoke these functions, I will get a reverse shell. And the return it you can see this is the response you will get when you invoke these functions. So this is how you can create the backdoor. So it's basically depend upon the how you want to creating the backdoor or how you want to access this account access for a long term basis. So it's basically depend advanced persistent threat also they creating the backdoor via misusing the functionality of Lambda functions. They're creating the backdoor in third party library because it's rarely checked by the developer or any other security tools. So suppose this is a file. I'm creating the zip file for this particular file. So let's create a zip file to become this function. Now I'm using the same command. So you can see here basically I downloaded the code, I modified the code and I update the code. Then we are going to invoke this function. So I'll get a reverse shell. So what we are going to do, we are going to open a new tab, go to dashboard, because the code which we have in the dashboard, updated code, we are copy this whole thing. And what is the information you need. So let's see what is the function or file name. So you can see the file name is Lambda functions. Let's .zip. Let's copy this one. .zip. Okay, now you have to change the function name. So function name which we are going to change, you can see here, this is the function which we are going to change and which we can invoke using API gateway. So I'm using this function, and you have to specify the profile as well as reason, because this is also important case. Okay, so I specify the profile as well as user regions, and you know that the users which we compromise is, the profile which is there in LAMP for this user have sufficient rights so they can perform the update function code operation. So they can execute this particular command, because this user have administrator rights on Lambda functions on all the resources. Let's update this one. You can see it's updated successfully. So it will basically replace your previous code and update the new code. This is a memory size, this is a function, and this is going to update. So function will be the same, invocation method will be the same, but code will be updated. So what will be the difference? So difference will be, this is your code, this is the same code, this is the same function, but it's added a new backdoor there in this particular code. When you're going to hit this API, you will get a reverse shell. Let's see. So I'm just open my command and control server. Okay, I'm listening on port 7777, and I'm going to hit this particular API, because we crafted the API. If we hit this particular API, you will get and your code will be executed and you will get a reverse shell. Let's copy this function. Let's copy this command. You can use any HTTP client. So currently I'm using curl command here. So let's copy here. You don't need to specify an API key or any authorization token. You can directly hit. You can see we get a connection from this particular IP. and this is internal server error what we are getting here. Let's listing, hit these functions, and you can see this is the so there is one connection which is coming from this particular, where this function, where this runtime environment of this Lambda function, why it's going to close, because it's a so basically it is a we can say serverless, the function itself have a runtime, it's have a serverless. That's why you won't get any interactive shells. So you can execute, you can create a script for automations. So you will get a semi-interactive shell. So it will basically execute the function. You will get a shell. You can execute the command there. So this is how you won't get any fully interactive shell using, because the runtime environment which used by the functions is it's basically a container environment. In the container itself, it's a serverless. So when it's executed, it will leave all these things. So that's why every time you invoke this function. So let's see, open it again, and when I'm going to hitting these functions, you will get a connection from here. After some time, it will be closed. So you can see it will be closed and you will get an internal server error. So you can modify the code and you can execute the function. But why I'm getting this, I'm not getting any interactive shell. It's because of the functionality of Lambda function itself. It's not running all the time. Just like if you have a EC2 instance, it's running all the time and you will get a fully interactive shell. It won't die. But in case of Lambda function, it's basically run when it's required. When it's executed, when your function or a command is executed, it will be clear all this thing, and it won't consume the resources. Basically, won't consume the computation resources. So that's why your shell will die. But you can modify the code. This is the perspective of to define and how you can create the persistency. You can modify the other code. So whenever anybody invoke, you will get the shell. You can specify the command there. So when every time anybody invoke, you will get the shell. Or you can invoke this thing. You can create a automation script where you will get a shell. You can specify the command and it will be it will execute the command and it will be die. So this is how you can create a you can create a automation script. Then every 10 or 15 seconds it will invoke a functions, because API gateway also have this timeout functionality. So you can invoke the function using API gateway, you will get a shell. So this is how you can create the persistency. There's a multiple way to create the persistency. You can create a different functions. You can update the code in existing function. You can update the code not in the source code of the function, but the layer of the function. So whenever or wherever this particular layer is used, you will get your code will be executed on the particular environment or containers. And there's one more thing. It's basically depend upon what rights or what role is attached to this particular function. So you can execute the other AWS services, or you can invoke the other AWS services on behalf of the role which is attached to this particular function. So there is multiple way you can have the persistence access on AWS account via misusing the Lambda functions. So as we discussed, we have we compromise with user which have a sufficient right. We download the code, then again we upload the code here, and we invoke the API. We invoke this function using API gateway, and you will get a reverse shell, or your command will be executed there. So it's basically depend upon what backdoor you created, what type of backdoor you have, and what functionality of this particular Lambda function have. You can create a persistence access. So this is all about this video. Thank you so much for watching this video.